Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The last light of day stretched across the prairie, painting the tall grasses in amber and gold as Thomas Mercer guided his horse along the narrow dirt path. At 32, he had left behind the crowded streets of Saint-Denis for a position as the new schoolteacher in the small settlement of Willowbrook. Something in Thomas had longed for open spaces and simpler rhythms after years surrounded by brick and stone. His mare, a dappled grey named Autumn, moved at an unhurried pace, seeming to savour the evening air. Thomas had taken to exploring the surrounding countryside after his teaching duties. Today's ride had taken him farther than usual, following tales from his students about an old windmill that stood alone on the prairie's edge. The structure appeared on the horizon just as Thomas began considering turning back, a solitary sentinel silhouetted against the darkening sky. Though weathered by decades of sun and storm, the windmill retained a certain dignity, its wooden frame still sound, its metal blades turning slowly in the gentle evening breeze with a rhythmic creaking that carried across the otherwise silent landscape. As they approached, the sound of the turning mechanism became more distinct, not the harsh grinding he expected from abandoned machinery, but something almost melodic, as if the wood and metal had, over years of exposure to the elements, learnt to sing together in rough harmony. "Quite a sight, isn't she?" came a voice from behind, startling Thomas from his contemplation. He turned to find an elderly man on horseback, his face deeply lined by decades of prairie sun, eyes clear and sharp beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. "I didn't hear you approach," Thomas admitted, extending his hand. "Thomas Mercer. I'm the new school teacher at Willowbrook." "Harlan Wade," the older man replied, his handshake firm despite gnarled fingers that spoke of years of hard labor. "My ranch starts about 2 miles east of here. Been watching you ride out this way and figured you'd find the old mill eventually." He gestured toward the structure with a slight nod. "Most newcomers do, sooner or later. She has a way of drawing folks in." Thomas studied the rancher's expression, noting the blend of amusement and something deeper, perhaps respect, in his weathered features. "My students mention it often. They seem to have quite elaborate stories about it." Harlan chuckled, the sound as rough and warm as the prairie soil itself. "Children always do. Their imaginations ain't been fenced in yet." He dismounted with surprising agility for a man his age, approaching the base of the windmill, though in this case, their fancies might not stray far from truth. Intrigued, Thomas followed suit, securing Autumn beside the rancher's mount. As they stood at the windmill's base, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a deepening blue sky where the first stars had begun to appear. The breeze that had been present throughout the afternoon seemed to pause momentarily, bringing the windmill's blades to a temporary standstill. In that moment of perfect stillness, Thomas heard it, or thought he did. A sound so faint it might have been imagination, like distant voices carried on the wind, not distinct enough to discern words, but unmistakably human in their cadence and tone. Then the breeze returned, the blades resumed their turning, and the sound merged once again with the creaking of the mechanism. "You heard it," Harlan stated rather than asked, watching Thomas's face with knowing eyes. Thomas hesitated, reluctant to acknowledge something that reason suggested couldn't exist. "I'm not sure what I heard." "The whispers," Harlan supplied without hesitation. "That's what the locals call them. Voices that come when the wind holds its breath, like the land itself is trying to speak." He ran a calloused hand along the weathered wood of the windmill's support beam. "Been that way long as I can remember. And my grandfather before me said the same." The scholarly part of Thomas wanted to dismiss the notion as frontier superstition, yet something in Harlan's matter-of-fact tone, combined with what he'd just experienced, gave him pause. "What are they saying?" he asked, surprising himself with the question that implicitly accepted the whisper's reality. Harlan shrugged, his expression thoughtful as he gazed up at the slowly turning blades, now silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Depends on who's listening, I reckon. Some hear warnings, some hear welcome. My grandfather claimed they were the voices of those who lived and died on this land before we came. Not just settlers, but the native folk before them, and maybe the land itself." He glanced at Thomas with a hint of challenge in his eyes. "Course, educated men like yourself probably have scientific explanations. Wind patterns and hollow wood creating some kind of natural phonograph." Thomas considered this reasonable explanation, finding it simultaneously plausible and insufficient. "Science explains a great deal," he acknowledged, "but perhaps not everything." Something in Harlan's expression softened at this concession. "You might do all right out here after all, schoolteacher." He looked back toward the horizon, where the last purple light was fading. "Most who come from the city bring their certainties with them like luggage, taking comfort in explaining away the things they don't understand. The prairie has a way of wearing down such certainties, given time." The ride to Harlan's ranch passed mostly in companionable silence, broken occasionally by the rancher's casual observations about landmarks visible in the moonlight, or brief warnings about patches of terrain that required careful navigation. Despite the darkness, Harlan moved with absolute confidence through the landscape, his familiarity with every rise and dip in the prairie evident in the way he guided his mount without hesitation. As they crested a gentle slope, the ranch came into view, a collection of sturdy buildings arranged in practical formation around a central yard, lamplight glowing from several windows despite the late hour. The woman emerged from what appeared to be the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth tucked into her apron. Though her hair had gone silver and lines mapped her face, her movements suggested someone for whom age represented accumulated capability rather than diminishment. "Found a visitor, Martha," Harlan announced, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "The new schoolteacher from Willowbrook got himself too far out near the old windmill as darkness fell." Martha's expression showed neither surprise nor inconvenience at the unannounced guest, merely warm assessment as she extended her hand. "Thomas Mercer," Thomas introduced himself, impressed by the strength in her handshake. "Pleased to meet you properly," she replied. "The children have been full of stories about their new teacher. All good," she added with a small smile, "though I suspect they may exaggerate your height somewhat. From their telling, I half expected a man who'd need to duck through doorways." Thomas laughed, grateful for the easy welcome. "Children have their own measuring systems, I've found, one that often involves more imagination than accuracy." "Speaking of imagination," Martha continued, turning toward what was clearly a familiar topic between her and Harlan, "I assume you found him out by that windmill because of all the stories." Harlan nodded, settling into a chair near the fire with a contented sigh. "Heard the whispers too, clear as anything. Didn't try to explain them away either." which shows more sense than most educated folk who find themselves out there. Martha gave Thomas an appraising look, as if re-evaluating him based on this new information. "Hungry?" she asked after a moment, the practical question serving as both acceptance and change of subject. At Thomas's grateful acknowledgement, she returned to the kitchen, reappearing moments later with a plate of cold meat, bread, and preserves that tasted far better than their simple appearance might suggest. As Thomas ate, Harlan filled his wife in on various ranch matters, reports delivered without unnecessary elaboration but containing all essential information about cattle conditions, water sources, and staff activities. Martha listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her full partnership in the operation. Their interaction displayed the comfortable rhythm of people who had moved through life together for so long that communication had been refined to its most efficient essence. Only when these practical matters had been addressed did the conversation return to the windmill and its mysteries. "Harlan tells me you heard the whispers," Martha said, studying Thomas with interest as she took a seat beside her husband. "Most city folk don't, even when standing right beside it. The land doesn't speak to those who've forgotten how to listen." "I'm not certain what I heard," Thomas admitted. "It was so faint, like voices from a great distance, or perhaps just memory of voices." Martha nodded, as if this description confirmed something. "That's how it starts. A suggestion rather than a declaration. The windmill doesn't force its stories on anyone. You speak as if it has intention," Thomas observed, curious rather than challenging. "All things that endure develop something like intention," Martha replied without hesitation. "The windmill stood for nearly 60 years, through blizzards, droughts, and the worst thunderstorms the prairie can conjure. It's anchored itself to that spot through time in a way that matters." Harlan leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees, his expression thoughtful in the firelight. "My grandfather built it in 1857, when this territory was still mostly wild. Started as a practical thing, needed water for cattle, and the underground stream there runs steady even in dry years. But right from the beginning, something about that spot felt different." "Different how?" Thomas asked, setting aside his empty plate. "Like it had been waiting," Harlan said simply. Grandfather claimed he'd ridden past that exact location dozens of times, never giving it much thought. Then one day he stopped there to rest his horse, fell asleep under the cottonwood that used to stand nearby, said he dreamed of cool water flowing beneath the ground, and woke knowing exactly where to dig the well. He shrugged slightly. "Could be he just noticed signs a less experienced eye would miss. Soil differences, certain plants that grow near water. But he believed the land had shown him, plain as any map." Martha picked up the thread with practiced ease. "The windmill went up that same summer, drew water just as expected, still does for wild creatures mostly, now that we've dug closer wells for the ranch. But by winter, folks were already talking about the sounds. How on certain nights, when the wind moved a particular way, you could hear voices in the turning of those blades." Thomas tried to reconcile this account with his brief experience. "The whispers I heard came when the wind stopped and the blades paused." "It varies," Harlan acknowledged. "Some hear them in the creaking, some in the stillness between. Some claim to hear them carried on the wind itself, having nothing to do with the windmill except that it marks the spot where hearing them becomes possible." He gestured vaguely toward the window, beyond which lay the dark prairie. "Land this vast holds a lot of stories, most never written down. Maybe they need somewhere to gather, somewhere they can find ears willing to listen." The explanation balanced on the edge between poetry and superstition, yet Thomas found himself reluctant to dismiss it. His brief encounter at the windmill had left him with a sense of presence that transcended rational explanation, a feeling that the solitary structure served as more than mere machinery for drawing water. "Does everyone hear the same whispers?" he asked, genuinely curious about these accumulated experiences. Martha exchanged a glance with Harlan before responding. "No. What people hear seems to align with what they need, or what they're ready for." She hesitated, then continued more personally. "When our households and the fleet went mad, I went away with him when I felt my heart suffer. I heard a child's laughter when I visited, not mocking but gentle, like an assurance that joy continues somewhere beyond our sight." The simple statement, delivered without dramatic flourish, carried more weight for its restraint. Thomas murmured appropriate condolences, which the couple acknowledged with the quiet dignity of those who had absorbed grief into the fabric of their lives without allowing it to unravel their purpose. "The windmill offers different things to different people," Harlan concluded after a moment of respectful silence. "Comfort to some, clarity to others, occasionally warnings, though those are rare and should be heeded." He rose, stretching slightly, as one who knows his body's limitations but refuses to be governed by them. "Best get some rest. You're welcome to stay for breakfast before heading back to town tomorrow." Thomas accepted this practical conclusion to their conversation, recognizing the frontier custom of addressing mystical subjects only to the extent necessary before returning to the tangible demands of daily life. As Martha showed him to a small but comfortable guest room, he found himself grateful not only for the shelter, but for the unexpected window into local folklore their hospitality had provided. Later, lying in darkness broken only by moonlight filtering through simple curtains, Thomas replayed his experience at the windmill. The whispers had been so faint, so easily dismissed as imagination or the natural sounds of wind through weathered wood. Yet now, attempting to recall their exact quality, he found himself uncertain whether he'd truly heard them with his ears or somehow perceived them through some other sense entirely, as if they had bypassed conventional pathways of perception to register directly in his awareness. Such thoughts would have seemed absurd in his previous life, surrounded by the certainties of academic discourse and urban rationality. But here, with the vast prairie surrounding him and the star-filled sky visible through his window, the rigid boundaries between the explainable and the mysterious seemed less absolute. Sleep claimed him gradually, his last conscious thoughts filled with images of the solitary windmill turning steadily beneath a canopy of stars, marking time in a landscape where time itself seemed to flow differently than in the world he had left behind. Morning arrived with the soft clarity characteristic of the prairie in early autumn, sunlight that illuminated without harsh intensity, air that carried the faint sweetness of ripening grasses and late-blooming wildflowers. Thomas joined the Wades for a breakfast that, like dinner the previous evening, demonstrated the substantial comfort possible on even isolated homesteads when managed with skill and foresight. Conversation remained primarily practical, focused on directions for his return journey to Willowbrook and observations about weather patterns that might affect his ride. Only as Thomas prepared to depart did Harlan return to the subject of the windmill. "You'll be going back," the rancher stated, rather than asked, as they stood beside their horses in the yard. Thomas nodded, not bothering to deny what seemed suddenly inevitable. "Yes, I think I will." "Good." Harlan adjusted Autumn's saddle slightly, his hands moving with the casual expertise of one who had performed such actions thousands of times. "The windmill doesn't speak to everyone. If it shared something with you, there's likely more to follow." He straightened, regarding Thomas directly. "One piece of advice, if you'll take it. Visit alone at least the next few times. The whispers come clearer that way, without another's expectations coloring what you hear. Thomas accepted this guidance with appropriate gravity, recognizing it as genuine concern rather than superstitious prescription. After expressing sincere gratitude for the Wade's hospitality, he mounted Autumn and set off toward Willowbrook, the morning sun warm on his back, and thoughts of the solitary windmill already drawing his imagination forward to future visits. The following days passed in the established rhythms of his teaching duties. Lessons delivered, assignments assessed, small triumphs celebrated as his students mastered new concepts. Yet beneath these familiar patterns ran a current of anticipation, a growing awareness that something had shifted in his relationship with the territory he now called home. Thomas found himself paying closer attention to his students' casual references to local landmarks and traditions, particularly those concerning the windmill. Most mentioned it only in passing, as a known feature of their landscape rather than an object of particular fascination. But one child, a quiet, thoughtful girl named Eliza, who often remained after class to help organize books, eventually approached his desk with more direct interest. "Mr. Mercer," she began with the careful formality characteristic of her speech, "my mamma says you've been out to the talking windmill." Thomas regarded her with mild surprise, both at the information's rapid travel through the small community and at her choice of description. "The talking windmill, is that what you call it?" Eliza nodded solemnly, her eyes remarkably observant for a child of 10, studying his reaction. "That's what it does, isn't it? It talks to people who know how to listen. Have you heard it yourself?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious about her experience. "Once," she confirmed, arranging pencils in perfect alignment as she spoke. "Pa took me out that way last spring when he was checking fence lines. Said I could rest in the shade while he worked." Her methodical organization continued as she recounted the experience. "The windmill told me a story about a family that got lost in a big storm, not with real words exactly, but I understood anyway." Thomas considered her account, struck by the matter-of-fact tone that suggested complete conviction in what she had experienced. "What happened to the family in the story?" he asked, careful to treat her recollection with appropriate seriousness. "They were scared at first," Eliza replied, her focus still on the pencils before her. "The storm was so big they couldn't see which way to go. But then they found the windmill and stayed beside it until morning came. It kept them safe." She looked up, finally, her expression earnest. "The windmill remembers them, even though they're long gone. It remembers everybody who passes by, even if they don't notice it at all." The simplicity of this assessment, delivered without drama or embellishment, carried a persuasive authenticity that resonated with Thomas's own limited experience at the site. Before he could frame an appropriate response, Eliza continued with unexpected directness. "You should go back soon. It gets lonesome out there sometimes with no one to listen properly." With that remarkably adult observation, she gathered her belongings and departed, leaving Thomas to contemplate the curious alignment between her casual advice and his own growing inclination to return to the solitary structure that had captured his imagination. That inclination crystallized into decision the following Saturday, when teaching responsibilities yielded to personal time. The morning dawned clear and mild, perfect conditions for a longer ride, and Thomas set out from Willowbrook with provisions sufficient for a day's exploration, his path deliberately focused toward the distant windmill that had occupied his thoughts throughout the intervening week. The journey seemed shorter on this second occasion, perhaps because he followed memory rather than directions, or perhaps simply because anticipation compressed his perception of time passing. By mid-morning, The windmill appeared on the horizon, its familiar silhouette drawing him forward across the gently rolling terrain that had become less foreign with each day spent in this new landscape. As he approached, Thomas was struck again by the structure's solitary dignity, how it stood as both practical mechanism and unintentional monument, marking a specific point in the vast prairie with quiet persistence. Its blades turned slowly in the light breeze, the familiar creaking audible from some distance as he guided Autumn toward their destination. Reaching the windmill, Thomas dismounted and secured his horse in the shade of the structure itself. Unlike his previous visit, interrupted by darkness and Harlan's arrival, he now had ample time to examine the windmill more thoroughly. Its construction revealed careful craftsmanship, joints precisely fitted despite decades of exposure to elements, metal components showing signs of regular maintenance despite the structure's apparent isolation. The well beneath functioned as Harlan had described, its water accessible through a simple pump mechanism that Thomas tested with experimental strokes of the handle. Clear, cool water emerged after initial resistance, suggesting the system remained fully operational despite its presumably limited use now that the ranch had established more convenient sources. These practical observations occupied Thomas for some time as he circled the structure, examining its integration with the landscape from different angles. Eventually, however, his inspection complete, he settled on a convenient stone near the windmill's base, content to simply observe as the blades continued their hypnotic rotation against the backdrop of blue sky and distant horizons. Time passed differently in this setting, he discovered. Without the rigid schedule of school bells or urban appointments, minutes expanded and contracted according to less defined rhythms, the passage of occasional clouds across the sun, the distant movement of what might be antelope at the prairie's edge, the gradual shifting of shadows as morning advanced toward afternoon. Thomas had brought a book, a collection of regional historical accounts he'd borrowed from Willowbrook's modest library, but found himself disinclined to read, preferring instead to simply absorb the atmosphere of this particular place that had drawn him back with such quiet insistence. The breeze remained steady, the windmill's blades maintaining their regular turning, the creaking mechanism providing a constant, yet somehow unobtrusive soundtrack to his contemplation. He wasn't certain how long he had been sitting when he first noticed the change, how the breeze that had blown consistently since his arrival suddenly faltered, then ceased entirely. The windmill's blades slowed, their movement becoming increasingly hesitant until they stopped completely, frozen in position against the now still air. In the perfect silence that followed, Thomas held his breath without conscious intention, some instinct suggesting that even that small sound might interfere with what might emerge in this moment of absolute calm. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Just the extraordinary stillness of the prairie holding its breath alongside him. Then he heard them. The whispers, clearer now than during his first visit, though still not distinct enough to discern actual words. Multiple voices speaking simultaneously, their tones varying from what might be excitement to deeper notes of solemnity, creating a complex harmony of human expression that seemed to emanate from the very air around the windmill rather than from any specific direction. Thomas remained motionless, afraid that any movement might break the delicate connection that had formed. The whispers continued, their cadence rising and falling like conversation heard through walls, the emotional tenor clear even when specific content remained elusive. Within this ambient murmur, certain patterns began to emerge, drawing his attention to what seemed like a central narrative, gradually separating itself from the broader chorus. A story about shelter in darkness, about finding unexpected safety when hope seemed lost, about gratitude that persisted beyond individual memory, becoming part of the landscape itself. As he listened, images formed in Thomas's mind, not with the sharp clarity of actual vision, but with the suggestive power of memory or dream. A family huddled beside this very windmill as a terrible storm raged across the prairie. Parents sheltering children beneath equipment that had, coincidentally, created a small haven from driving rain and hail. Morning arriving to reveal a transformed landscape where familiar landmarks had disappeared beneath flood or haze, requiring them to begin again from this fixed point that had preserved their lives through the night. The story resonated with what Eliza had described, the lost family finding safety beside the windmill, yet contained layers of detail and emotional nuance beyond what the child had articulated. Thomas found himself wondering whether she had experienced the same vision differently, her younger mind translating complex impressions into simpler narrative, or whether the windmill perhaps shared different aspects of its accumulated experiences with different listeners. As suddenly as it had arrived, the absolute stillness broke. A breath of wind stirred the grasses around him. The windmill's blades creaked into reluctant motion, and the whispers faded, not abruptly, but gradually diminishing, like a conversation moving away down a long corridor, still continuing but no longer within clear perception. Thomas released his held breath, becoming aware of physical sensations temporarily forgotten during his immersion in the experience. The warmth of sun on his shoulders, the solid stone beneath him, the distant nickering of autumn responding to the resumed breeze. The ordinary world reasserted itself, yet seemed somehow altered, as if the brief glimpse into another form of perception had permanently adjusted his relationship with visible reality. He remained seated for some time, allowing the experience to settle within him, rather than immediately attempting to analyze or categorize it. The rational part of his mind, the educator trained in systematic thought, already generated potential explanations involving acoustics, psychology, and the power of suggestion. Yet another aspect of his consciousness recognized something in the experience that transcended such explanations. A genuine encounter with narrative, embedded in landscape through processes more complex than conventional understanding could fully encompass. As afternoon advanced toward evening, Thomas finally rose, stretching muscles stiffened by prolonged stillness. He approached the windmill once more, placing his palm against the weathered wood of its central support, as if establishing physical connection with what had just offered such an extraordinary experience. "Thank you," he said quietly, feeling neither foolish nor superstitious in addressing the structure directly, whether the whispers originated from some property of the windmill itself, from collective memory somehow preserved in this specific location, or from some interaction between his own consciousness and the accumulated history of this place, seemed less important than acknowledging what had been shared. As he mounted Autumn for the return journey to Willowbrook, Thomas glanced back at the solitary structure continuing its patient rotation against the late afternoon sky. Something had changed in his perception of this new territory he now called home. A deepening connection, not just to its physical geography, but to the layered stories that gave the landscape meaning beyond mere topographical features. The windmill had offered him passage through an unseen doorway, providing a glimpse of how place and memory intertwined to create something richer than either could manifest alone. As he guided Autumn toward Willowbrook, Thomas carried this awareness with him, not as dramatic revelation demanding immediate action, but as subtle adjustment to his understanding of what it meant to truly inhabit a landscape, rather than merely reside upon it. The settlement appeared on the horizon as dusk approached, its scattered lights beginning to glow against the gathering darkness. Thomas realized he had crossed a threshold that day, not the dramatic conversion from skeptic to believer that tales of supernatural encounters often portrayed, but a more nuanced shift toward openness to experiences that existed in the borderlands between established categories of understanding. He would return to the windmill, certainly. The whispers had offered only fragments of their complete narrative, suggestions of stories that deserved fuller attention, but he would also carry their influence into his daily teaching, perhaps finding ways to help his students recognize the rich contextual knowledge embedded in their familiar surroundings, how history and landscape conversed constantly for those who developed the patience to listen. As autumn carried him into Willowbrook's quiet main street, Thomas felt a sense of rightness in his decision to leave city life behind. He had come seeking simpler rhythms and open spaces, but discovered instead a complexity of different order, one based not on urban sophistication, but on deeper connections between people, memory, and the enduring presence of the land itself. The following days passed in established routine, yet Thomas found himself changed in subtle ways by his experience at the windmill. He listened differently now, not just to words spoken directly, but to the spaces between them, to the histories that informed casual references, to the accumulated wisdom embedded in frontier expressions that had previously seemed merely colorful or quaint. His teaching shifted accordingly, incorporating more local knowledge into standard lessons. Mathematics problems calculated cattle grazing patterns rather than abstract numerical relationships. Writing assignments encouraged students to document family stories about settling the territory. Science observations focused on intimate understanding of local ecosystems rather than distant textbook examples. These adjustments didn't represent abandonment of academic standards, but rather their enrichment through meaningful context. Thomas noticed increased engagement from students who recognized themselves and their experiences in the curriculum, particularly from those like Eliza, whose quiet intelligence flowered when given opportunity to connect formal education with knowledge already absorbed through daily life. He returned to the windmill regularly, though not according to rigid schedule. Sometimes circumstances allowed weekly visits. Other times, school obligations or weather conditions created longer intervals between journeys to the solitary structure. Each visit yielded different experiences, some involving whispers that emerged in perfect stillness, others offering impressions that seemed carried directly on the wind itself. Gradually, through fragments gathered across multiple encounters, Thomas began assembling more complete understanding of the narratives embedded in that specific location. The family seeking shelter during the terrible storm of 1862 represented just one among many stories the windmill had witnessed or absorbed. There were cattle drivers following the old trails, travelers orienting themselves by the windmill's distinctive silhouette, native peoples who had considered the spot significant long before European settlement reshaped the territory. Not all stories emerged with equal clarity. Some appeared as brief impressions, flashes of emotion or atmosphere, rather than coherent narratives. Others developed across multiple visits, each encounter adding details to experiences initially perceived only in outline. The windmill shared its accumulated history not as organized chronicle, but as organic collection of moments preserved through some process Thomas couldn't fully comprehend, yet increasingly accepted as genuine. As winter approached, bringing shorter days and occasional fierce storms that temporarily isolated Willowbrook from surrounding territories, Thomas found his thoughts turning toward how to document what he was learning. The academic portion of his nature recognized value in preserving these experiences beyond his individual perception, creating record that might provide context for others drawn to the windmill's mysteries. Yet he hesitated, aware that something essential might be lost in translation from direct experience to written account. The whispers existed in realm where objectivity and subjectivity blended in ways that conventional documentation struggled to capture, where meaning emerged through relationship between listener and landscape rather than through empirical data alone. One particularly cold evening, as wind drove occasional snowflakes against his window, Thomas finally began writing. Not the formal historical record he had initially contemplated, but something more personal, a journal of encounters, describing not just what he perceived at the windmill, but how these experiences were gradually reshaping his understanding of place, memory, and connection. He worked by lamplight, the words flowing with surprising ease as he recounted his initial skepticism, subsequent openness, and the incremental expansion of awareness that had followed. The writing continued past midnight, each anecdote leading naturally to the next, until he had created faithful account of his journey thus far, acknowledging both the whisper's reality and the questions that remained unanswered. As he eventually closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Thomas realized he had begun a process similar to what the windmill itself represented, creating repository for experience that others might eventually encounter, contributing to ongoing conversation between past and present that gave the territory its particular character. The thought brought unexpected contentment, a sense of participation in continuum that extended beyond individual lifetime to connect with both those who had come before and those who would follow. Winter deepened, temporarily limiting his visits to the windmill, as snow transformed the prairie into challenging terrain for solitary travel. During this enforced separation, Thomas continued developing his journal, supplementing his own observations with local accounts gathered through careful conversations with longtime residents. Harlan and Martha Wade proved particularly valuable sources, sharing not only their personal experiences, but stories passed down through generations about the windmill and its significance in regional history. When spring finally arrived, melting snow and drying trails into passable condition, Thomas returned to the windmill with renewed anticipation. The structure had weathered another winter successfully, its mechanism still functioning, its presence on the landscape unchanged despite months of harsh conditions. Yet something had shifted in Thomas's perception. Where he had initially approached the windmill as mysterious anomaly, something to be investigated and potentially explained, he now recognized it as an integral component of the living landscape, no more separate from its surroundings than the prairie grasses or the underground stream that fed its well. Settling into his customary position near the windmill's base, Thomas experienced familiar transition as the constant breeze momentarily stilled. The rotating blades gradually slowed to complete stop, and the whispers emerged in the perfect silence that followed. This time, however, the voices seemed to acknowledge his presence more directly, as if his repeated visits had established relationship that allowed more intentional communication. The whispers still stopped short of distinct words, yet conveyed clearer impressions, expressions of continuity, of endurance through changing seasons, of satisfaction in being truly heard after periods of isolation. Thomas listened with the patience he had developed through practice, allowing the communication to unfold at its own pace rather than imposing expectations or demands. When the breeze eventually returned and the whispers faded, he opened his journal, adding fresh observations with the care of someone documenting not just personal experience, but something of broader significance. The windmill had become more than curiosity or local folklore in his understanding. It represented living connection between past and present, between human experience and landscape, between individual perception and collective memory. As he prepared to return to Willowbrook that afternoon, Thomas noticed a rider approaching from the direction of the Wade Ranch, Harlan's familiar silhouette, recognizable even at distance. He waited, closing his journal and returning it to his saddlebag as the rancher drew closer. "Thought I might find you here," Harlan called as he came within conversational range. "First decent weather we've had in months. Figured you'd make straight for the old windmill first chance you got." Thomas acknowledged this accurate assessment with a smile. "It's been too long since my last visit." Harlan dismounted with his characteristic economy of movement, surveying the structure with the fond familiarity of long association. "She weathered the winter well enough. Had my hands check her mechanism last week. Still turning true after all these years?" The casual reference to maintenance reminded Thomas that the windmill's continued existence wasn't merely a matter of sturdy construction, but resulted from ongoing care across generations. Human intervention that preserved what might otherwise have succumbed to natural deterioration. "Your family has maintained it all this time?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. "Going on 3 generations now?" Harlan confirmed, running a practiced hand along one of the support beams. "Grandfather built it. Father taught me how to keep it sound, and I've shown my ranch hands the same." He glanced at Thomas with hint of amusement. "Though I imagine you've figured out it's more than just practical machinery by now." "The whispers," Thomas acknowledged simply. "They've become clearer with each visit." Harlan nodded, seemingly satisfied with this confirmation. "Not everyone hears them, even with repeated visits. The windmill chooses its confidants carefully." This statement might have struck Thomas as superstitious fancy months earlier, but experience had adjusted his perspective. "Why do you think that is?" he asked, genuinely curious about the rancher's longer perspective. "Some people come looking for answers," Harlan observed, gazing thoughtfully at the slowly turning blades overhead. "But the windmill doesn't offer answers exactly. More like invitations to deeper questions. Those who insist on certainties generally leave disappointed." The assessment aligned with Thomas's own experience, how each visit yielded impressions that expanded his awareness, while simultaneously revealing greater complexity beyond initial understanding. The whispers offered connection rather than conclusion, engagement rather than explanation. "I've started documenting my experiences," Thomas mentioned, indicating the journal in his saddlebag, "though words seem inadequate for much of what happens here." "Always the way with the most important things," Harlan agreed without hesitation. "But the effort matters, I think. Each generation needs someone willing to put experience into words, however imperfect." He regarded Thomas with surprising intensity. "The children in your school, they need bridges between what education tells them is important and what this land knows is true. Your writing might help build those connections." The observation carried weight beyond casual conversation, suggesting purpose that transcended personal curiosity or academic documentation. Thomas recognized truth in the rancher's assessment, how his evolving relationship with the windmill had already informed his teaching, helping students connect formal knowledge with lived experience in ways that enriched both. "I hope so," he replied simply, accepting both the responsibility implied and the limitations inherent in translating direct experience into communicable form. They stood together in companionable silence as afternoon light cast long shadows across the prairie, each man contemplating personal relationship with this solitary structure that had somehow accumulated significance beyond its practical function. Eventually, Harlan gestured toward Willowbrook's distant outline. "Town's growing," he observed. "Railroad surveyors were through last month, talking about a spur line that might reach here within 2 years. Change is coming, as they always do." The observation carried no judgment, merely acknowledgement of inevitable progression that had transformed territories since long before either man's lifetime. Yet Thomas found himself wondering how such development might affect the windmill and the subtle communications it facilitated. "Progress has its place," Harlan continued, seemingly following Thomas's unspoken concern. "But so does preservation of what matters. This windmill stood before Willowbrook existed and may well outlast whatever the town eventually becomes." He patted the weathered wood with familiar affection. "Some connections need protecting, especially as the world around them changes." The statement contained both reassurance and subtle charge, recognition that meaningful relationship between people and landscape required active stewardship rather than mere sentimental attachment. Thomas nodded understanding, already considering how his documentation might contribute to preserving awareness of the windmill's significance beyond practical mechanics or picturesque scenery. As they prepared to depart, each returning to their respective responsibilities in this corner of the frontier, Thomas took a final moment to place his hand against the windmill's central support, a gesture of acknowledgement that had become ritual during his visits. The wood felt warm beneath his palm, despite the cool spring air, as if the structure retained something of the lives and stories it had witnessed across decades of patient observation. "Until next time," he said quietly, the words intended for the windmill rather than his human companion. Riding back toward Willowbrook beside Harlan, Thomas contemplated the journey that had brought him from city classroom to this expansive landscape where education expanded to include wisdom carried on the wind and preserved in weathered wood. The whispers had become part of his understanding now, not dramatic intervention demanding radical change, but gentle reminder of connections that existed beneath surface appearances. In his saddlebag, the journal contained beginnings of record that might eventually help others recognize similar connections in their own experience. Not definitive explanation or final account, but invitation to listen differently to landscapes that held more than eye could perceive or conventional history record. The windmill continued its steady turning behind them, marking time in its own distinct rhythm as it had for generations before their arrival and would for untold years after their passing. Thomas glanced back once, seeing the structure silhouetted against the afternoon sky, solitary sentinel preserving memories that otherwise might fade beyond recovery. In that moment, he knew with certainty that he had found home not just in Willowbrook, or even the broader territory, but in this particular relationship with place that the windmill had helped him discover. This ongoing conversation between past and present, between human perception and landscape memory, between tangible reality and the whispers that revealed its deeper dimensions. The prairie stretched around them, vast and seemingly unchanged, despite the railroad's approaching influence. Yet Thomas now perceived it differently, not as empty expanse awaiting human development, but as living repository of experiences accumulated across centuries, speaking constantly to those who developed patience to listen properly. The whispers would continue, sometimes audible and sometimes beyond perception, but always present, like underground water flowing beneath apparently dry land. His role was not to explain them conclusively, but to maintain connection, to visit the solitary windmill, not just as curious observer, but as willing participant in ongoing exchange between human consciousness and the enduring presence of place itself. As Willowbrook appeared more clearly on the horizon, Thomas settled into this understanding with quiet satisfaction. He had come seeking simpler life, but discovered instead richer complexity. Not the frantic complications of urban existence, but the layered depth of meaningful relationship with environment that acknowledged dimensions beyond immediate utility or rational explanation. The windmill had become his anchor in this new understanding, not by providing definitive answers, but by demonstrating how questions themselves could create connections across time and between seemingly separate categories of experience. Its whispers offered not conclusion, but continuation, invitation to participate in ongoing narrative that included but transcended individual perspective. Thomas would return to the structure regularly in coming years, his journal gradually expanding with observations and reflections that documented not just the whispers themselves, but how they informed his evolving relationship with the territory he now genuinely called home. The documentation remained imperfect, words never quite capturing the full quality of direct experience, yet valuable nonetheless, as potential bridge for others drawn to similar awareness. And sometimes, on particularly still evenings in Willowbrook, when breeze momentarily paused and ordinary sounds briefly subsided, Thomas imagined he could hear distant echoes of the windmill's whispers even there. Gentle reminder that meaningful connections, once established, extended beyond physical proximity to influence perception across expanding circles of awareness. In such moments, the prairie felt not like empty space between scattered settlements, but like living entity with which ongoing conversation remained possible for those who developed appropriate attention. The windmill had taught him how to listen differently, not just to dramatic declarations, but to patient persistence that accumulated significance through endurance rather than intensity. This altered awareness represented Thomas's true education, one that continued long after formal schooling had ended, expanding through direct engagement with landscape that preserved memories beyond written record. The whispers had become part of his understanding now, not as supernatural intervention, but as natural extension of place, speaking through accumulated experience that deserved acknowledgement rather than explanation. The windmill stood as physical embodiment of this process, practical mechanism transformed through time and attention into something that transcended original function without abandoning it. Thomas had found similar transformation in himself. Educator still committed to formal knowledge, yet increasingly aware of wisdom embedded in landscape that conventional curricula often overlooked. As Willowbrook welcomed them back with familiar sights and sounds, Thomas carried this awareness forward, not as dramatic revelation, but as quiet foundation for continuing life in territory that revealed its depths gradually to those willing to listen beyond ordinary perception. The whispers had become part of his inner landscape now, influencing how he understood both the prairie around him and his own place within its ongoing story. The windmill would continue its patient turning, marking time according to its own distinct rhythm, maintaining connections between past and present for those prepared to recognize significance beyond practical function or picturesque appearance. Its whispers would persist, sometimes heard and sometimes merely sensed, but always present as a reminder that landscape held more than eye could perceive or conventional history record. And Thomas would continue listening, his journal gradually expanding with observations that documented not conclusions but continuing conversation, ongoing relationship with place that acknowledged dimensions beyond immediate utility while remaining grounded in tangible reality of weathered wood and turning blades beneath prairie sky. The whispers of the windmill gradually fade into the night, carrying Thomas's story across the plains where memories dance with the evening breeze. As we leave behind the solitary sentinel that shared its collected wisdom with a newcomer who learned to listen, our journey through the untamed landscapes of the frontier continues. Just beyond the rolling hills, where the whispering windmill stands, past the horizons that Thomas Mercer contemplated under starlit skies, lies another tale waiting to be told. The land stretches ever outward, connecting stories across its vast expanse like scattered constellations overhead. As the first light of dawn touches the eastern sky, illuminating a different corner of this expansive territory, we find ourselves approaching a majestic formation known to locals as Morning Rock. Here, where golden sunlight first greets the day, another gentle mystery unfolds, one of quiet companionship and peaceful solitude. Join us now as we journey to the weathered slopes of Morning Rock, where a special Mustang has made its home, and where the boundary between dreams and waking blurs beneath the wide open sky. Our next story begins as the stars fade and morning light washes across the ancient stone. The first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate strokes of lavender and gold as Thomas Everett eased himself from his bed, careful not to disturb the quiet that blanketed his small cabin. At 73, rising before the sun had become less a habit and more a necessity. Sleep came less easily these days, and his body, weathered by decades of hard work, often woke him with whispered reminders of its age. His joints protested as he dressed, pulling on the worn denim and cotton that had been his uniform for most of his life, but he moved with the deliberate patience that had become his companion in later years. Through the window he could see the silhouette of Morning Rock, a flat-topped mesa that rose from the landscape like a sentinel watching over the valley. Local stories said it had been sacred to the native peoples who had lived here before settlers arrived, and Thomas could understand why. There was something about the way the first light of day struck its surface, turning the weathered stone to burnished gold, that felt like a blessing being bestowed upon the land below. As he made his morning coffee, strong and black the way he'd always taken it, Thomas's mind wandered to the tale that had occupied his thoughts for the past several months. The sleepy Mustang, folks called it, a pale horse said to appear in the misty fields surrounding Morning Rock just as dawn broke over the horizon. Not wild, not skittish, but serene, grazing peacefully in the golden light as if it belonged to another time altogether. Some claimed it was the last descendant of Spanish Mustangs brought to these lands centuries ago. Others insisted it was something else entirely. A spirit horse, a living embodiment of the frontier's fading memory. Thomas had never put much stock in such fanciful notions during his working years. A horse was a horse, a partner in labor, deserving of respect and care, but bound by the same laws of nature as any other creature. Yet as the years had softened his certainties, he found himself more willing to entertain mysteries, and this particular mystery had taken root in his mind, growing stronger with each passing season. The soft sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted his reverie. A gentle knock followed, though the door swung open before he could answer. His granddaughter Hannah stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of morning dew and saddle leather. "Thought I might find you already up," she said, her smile crinkling the corners of eyes that matched his own in both color and quiet intensity. At 26, Hannah carried herself with a confidence that reminded Thomas of his late wife, though she had her father's height and lankier build. "Sleep's for those with less on their mind," Thomas replied, pouring a second cup of coffee and sliding it across the worn wooden table. "You're out early yourself." Hannah took the offered cup with a nod of thanks, warming her hands around its earthenware curve before taking a careful sip. "I figured today's the day, isn't it? First day of spring, clear skies, new moon last night. All the conditions the old-timers say bring the sleepy Mustang to Morning Rock." Thomas raised an eyebrow, though he couldn't hide the slight smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Hannah had always possessed an uncanny ability to read his intentions, even those he hadn't fully articulated to himself. "Might be," he allowed, looking out the window toward the mesa that was beginning to catch the first golden rays of sunlight. "Thought I might ride out that way, see what there is to see." "Which is why I brought Atlas over from the stable," Hannah said, referring to Thomas's favorite mount, a steady gelding with more patience than most humans Thomas had known. "He's saddled and waiting, along with Willow for me." Thomas turned from the window to look at his granddaughter more directly. "You planning on joining this fool's errand?" Hannah shrugged, the gesture deliberately casual, though her eyes remained intent. "Someone ought to keep you company, make sure you don't fall asleep in the saddle and end up in the next county." There was teasing in her tone, but Thomas recognized the undercurrent of concern. His health had been stable these past few years, but they both knew that at his age, solitary journeys carried risks that couldn't be dismissed with stubborn pride. And truth be told, he welcomed her company, not just as a precaution, but for the simple pleasure of sharing this quest with someone who wouldn't ridicule the seeking. "Reckon I could use the company," he conceded, finishing his coffee in one last swallow. "Though we'd best get moving if we aim to reach the eastern fields by sunrise proper." They departed as the sky continued its gradual transformation, darkness yielding to an ethereal blend of colors that seemed to exist nowhere else in nature. The air held the crisp clarity particular to spring mornings, carrying scents of damp earth and new growth. Thomas rode slightly ahead, his posture more upright than his aching back might prefer, but maintained through decades of habit. Atlas moved beneath him with the easy familiarity of a mount who knew his rider's rhythms and responding to the lightest touch of rein or shift of weight. The approach to Morning Rock followed a gentle slope through meadows, where Thomas had once grazed cattle in his younger years. Those days were long past, the ranch sold after his wife's passing, the herd dispersed to other operations when he'd decided that maintaining such an enterprise alone held more burden than joy. He'd kept only a small parcel of land with his cabin and a modest stable, where he'd boarded a few horses, including his own, enough to maintain connection to the life he'd known, without the constant demands that had once structured his days. "Grandpa!" Hannah's voice came from just behind his left shoulder, pitched to carry without disturbing the morning stillness. "Do you really believe it exists? The sleepy Mustang, I mean." Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, guiding Atlas around a patch of ground that looked deceptively solid but which he knew from experience concealed a muddy depression. "Belief's a funny thing when you reach my age," he finally replied. "I've seen things in my time that I can't explain, and I've found that most mysteries are neither as mystical as some would claim, nor as easily dismissed as others might prefer." He paused, gathering thoughts that seemed to drift like the morning mist around them. "I believe there's something to the stories. Whether it's exactly as told or not, too many reliable folks have seen something over too many years for it to be mere imagination. But what that something is, whether flesh and blood or something less tangible, I'm keeping an open mind about." Hannah nodded, accepting his answer without pressing for greater certainty. It was one of the qualities he most appreciated in her, the ability to sit comfortably with ambiguity rather than forcing each experience into predetermined categories. Her father, Thomas's son, had always needed things to be clearly defined, explained, categorized. A good man, hard-working and honest, but sometimes missing the wonder that existed in the spaces between certainties. As they continued their steady progress, the landscape opened before them. The eastern fields spread in a wide semicircle around the base of Morning Rock, their gently rolling contours interrupted occasionally by stands of cottonwood trees, whose leaves whispered in the slight breeze. In the growing light, Thomas could see wisps of ground fog hovering just above the tall grass, creating an otherworldly effect that transformed the familiar terrain into something from a half-remembered dream. "There," Hannah said suddenly, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. She pointed toward a copse of trees, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, where the fog seemed thicker, more concentrated. "Something's moving over there." Thomas followed her gesture, squinting slightly to focus aging eyes on the indicated spot. At first, he saw nothing beyond the drifting tendrils of mist weaving between tree trunks and swirling above the grass. Then, as if stepping from behind an invisible veil, a pale form emerged into a small clearing. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking it for anything other than a horse. Tall and lean, with the distinctive conformation that spoke of Spanish bloodlines preserved through generations. Its coat caught the early light with an almost luminous quality, not pure white but a soft palomino, so light it appeared to glow from within against the misty backdrop. The animal moved with unhurried grace, lowering its head occasionally to graze, before lifting it again to survey its surroundings with alert tranquility. "The sleepy Mustang," Thomas breathed, the words emerging unbidden. A lifetime of practical skepticism fell away in that moment, replaced by something that felt like recognition, as if he were encountering not a stranger, but a forgotten acquaintance from long ago. Beside him, Hannah remained silent, though he could sense her wonder matching his own. They sat motionless on their horses, neither wanting to disturb the moment or frighten the apparition before them. For several minutes, they simply watched as the pale horse grazed peacefully, seemingly unaware or unconcerned by their presence. "What now?" Hannah finally whispered, her eyes never leaving the Mustang. Thomas considered the question. Throughout his life, he had pursued goals with determination, building his ranch, raising his family, overcoming the numerous challenges that frontier life had presented. Even in retirement, he approached most activities with purpose and intent, yet something told him that this situation called for a different approach. "We wait," he replied softly, "and we watch. This isn't about capture or control. It's about bearing witness to something rare." And so they did, guiding their mounts to a small rise that afforded a clear view of the field where the pale Mustang continued its solitary grazing. Thomas dismounted carefully, his joints protesting the movement after the ride, and Hannah did the same. They secured their horses to a young cottonwood, though both Atlas and Willow seemed content to rest after the early morning journey. As full daylight gradually replaced the magical qualities of dawn, the Mustang remained, occasionally moving to a new patch of grass, but never straying far from the initial clearing. Its behavior seemed entirely ordinary, a horse simply enjoying the fresh spring growth. Yet there was something in its solitude and serene demeanor that supported the legends surrounding it. Whether supernatural or simply uncommon, the pale horse possessed a quality that set it apart from the domestic mounts Thomas had known throughout his life. "It's beautiful," Hannah murmured, settling beside Thomas on a sun-warmed boulder that provided a natural seat, "but not in a showy way. More like it belongs exactly where and how it is." Thomas nodded, understanding precisely what she meant. The Mustang embodied a kind of perfection that came not from exceptional features, but from complete harmony with its surroundings and circumstances. It existed fully in the present moment, untroubled by past or future, content in its solitary communion with the spring morning. As they watched, a meadowlark began to sing from a nearby fence post, its clear, fluting notes rising and falling in complex patterns. The Mustang lifted its head at the sound, ears forward, listening with what appeared to be appreciation before returning to its grazing. The simple interaction, birdsong acknowledged by attentive ears, struck Thomas as profoundly meaningful, though he would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly why. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about this moment for months now. Had all sorts of notions about what I might do if I actually found the sleepy Mustang. Thought perhaps I'd try to ride alongside it, one last time, feeling what it's like, to move in rhythm with a truly wild horse." He paused, watching as the pale Mustang moved with unhurried steps to a new patch of grass near a small seasonal stream that wound through the field. "But now that I'm here, I'm finding those plans don't matter much. Just seeing it, knowing it exists, that's enough." Hannah placed her hand gently on his weathered one, the gesture conveying understanding without need for words. They continued their quiet observation as morning progressed, the sun climbing higher, burning away mist and dew as the world fully awakened around them. Birds called, insects hummed, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote offered a belated farewell to the night with a series of yipping howls that echoed briefly before fading into silence. The Mustang showed no sign of departing, seemingly content to spend its morning in this peaceful meadow. Its presence had a curiously settling effect on Thomas, as if some restlessness he had carried without fully recognizing its weight was gradually easing. Here was living proof that some things endured beyond the relentless push of progress and change, that beauty and wildness and mystery remained present for those patient enough to seek them out. As mid-morning approached, Thomas noticed a figure moving along the distant trail that skirted the eastern edge of the fields. The newcomer traveled on foot rather than horseback, a somewhat unusual sight in country where distances typically demanded mounted transportation. A large case was slung across their back, its shape suggesting a musical instrument of some kind. "Looks like we're not the only ones abroad early today," Thomas observed, nodding toward the approaching figure. Hannah followed his gaze. "That's Elijah Cohen, I think, the musician who's been staying over at the Wilkins place. He plays at the saloon some evenings, violin and guitar mostly. Songs I've never heard before, but they sound like they've always existed, if that makes any sense." Thomas understood what she meant. Some music carried that quality of timelessness, as if it had been discovered rather than composed. He watched with interest as the man continued along the trail, his pace unhurried but purposeful. To Thomas's surprise, the traveler suddenly stopped, his attention apparently caught by something in the field. The same field where the pale Mustangs still grazed in solitary contentment. "Sees it too," Hannah whispered, a note of wonder in her voice. "I wasn't sure if everyone could." For a moment, Thomas wasn't certain what she meant. Then understanding dawned. Some part of him had wondered if the Mustang was visible only to him, a private vision conjured by an aging mind seeking connection to fading frontier ways. But Hannah had seen it from the first moment, and now this stranger had clearly spotted it as well, standing motionless on the trail, with his gaze fixed on the pale horse in the distance. After a minute of stillness, the musician moved deliberately off the trail, finding a seat on a fallen log at the field's edge. With careful movements that seemed designed not to startle the grazing horse, he unslung the case from his back and opened it, revealing what Thomas could now identify as a violin. The man lifted the instrument to his shoulder, bow poised, then paused as if listening to something only he could hear. When he began to play, the notes carried clearly across the open field, despite the distance. The melody emerged slowly, tentatively at first, like a question being carefully articulated. It was unlike anything Thomas had heard before. neither the boisterous fiddle tunes of local dances, nor the formal compositions occasionally performed by traveling musicians in larger towns. This music seemed to grow directly from the landscape itself, capturing the quality of morning light, the movement of mist, the patient presence of the pale horse grazing among spring grasses. The mustang lifted its head at the first notes, ears pricked forward with evident interest. For several moments it stood perfectly still, as if absorbing the melody. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, it began to move, not away from the music, but toward it, each step measured and deliberate as it gradually decreased the distance between itself and the musician. "Would you look at that?" he murmured, careful to keep his voice low enough not to disrupt the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. Hannah nodded, her expression reflecting the same wonder he felt. "It's like they know each other somehow." The observation seemed apt. There was a quality of recognition in the interaction, the pale horse approaching with curious trust, the musician continuing his impromptu performance with reverent focus. When the mustang had come within perhaps 30 yards of the log where the man sat playing, it stopped, head held high, its entire posture conveying attentive appreciation rather than the wariness wild horses typically displayed toward humans. For what might have been 10 minutes or might have been an hour, time seemed to lose its rigid structure in the presence of such an encounter. The musician played and the mustang listened. The melody evolved as it continued, gathering complexity while maintaining its essential character of gentle wonder. Thomas found himself affected not just by the beauty of the music, but by the profound rightness of the moment, the sense that he was witnessing something that transcended ordinary experience, without departing entirely from the natural world. Eventually the melody reached what felt like a natural pause, the notes hanging in the clear morning air, with a sense of suspension rather than finality. The musician lowered his instrument slightly, as if in contemplation, then raised it again to begin a new passage, this one carrying a different quality, like a conversation continuing after a moment of shared understanding. The new melody seemed to draw from deeper sources, reminiscent of old Spanish folk songs that might have accompanied the first horses brought to these lands centuries ago. There was something ancient in its cadence, a rhythm that spoke of journeys across vast distances, of adaptations to new landscapes, of bloodlines persisting through generations of change. The pale mustang responded to this shift with subtle alterations in its own demeanor. Its ears flicked forward with heightened attention, and it took several steps closer to the musician, reducing the distance between them to perhaps 20 yards. There it stopped again, but with a different quality to its stillness. Not wariness, but something akin to recognition. "It's remembering," Anna whispered, her insight striking Thomas as profoundly accurate, despite the apparent impossibility of a horse recalling music from ancestors it had never known. Yet watching the interaction unfold, he found himself believing exactly that something in the melody was activating cellular memories carried through generations, awakening recognition of sounds that had accompanied its forebears on their first journeys through these territories. The music created a bridge across time, connecting present moment to historical origins through the universal language of rhythm and tone. For nearly 10 minutes more, the musician played and the mustang listened, their connection transcending the usual boundaries between human and equine, between domesticated and wild, between present and past. Thomas found himself holding his breath at times, not wanting to disturb what felt like a sacred communication between representatives of two worlds that once had moved in closer harmony. When the melody finally drew to its true conclusion, the notes descended like settling dust, each finding its perfect resting place in the morning stillness. The musician lowered his instrument with reverent care, then offered a deeper bow to the pale horse. Not the casual acknowledgement of a performer to audience, but the profound respect of one being recognizing the essential dignity of another. The Mustang remained motionless for several heartbeats after the music ended, as if allowing its echoes to continue reverberating through its consciousness. Then, with deliberate grace that suggested ceremony rather than mere animal movement, it lowered its head and raised it again in what appeared to be a returned bow. The gesture was so human in its apparent intent that Thomas heard Hannah's small intake of breath beside him, confirming that she too perceived the extraordinary nature of what they witnessed. Only after this exchange did the Mustang turn, moving unhurriedly back across the field with the measured pace of one completing rather than fleeing an encounter. It eventually disappeared into the same copse of trees from which it had first emerged, the pale coat visible in occasional flashes between trunks and branches before vanishing entirely from view. Several days after their encounter with the sleepy Mustang, Thomas found himself drawn back to his porch in the early evening hours. The day's work, modest as it was in his retirement, had left him pleasantly tired, with the particular satisfaction that came from physical effort within his capabilities rather than beyond them. He settled into the old rocking chair that had been his companion through many such evenings, a cup of coffee cooling on the small table beside him. The western sky blazed with the spectacular colors particular to sunset in this region, deep oranges and purples, layered like an artist's careful brushstrokes across the fading blue. In the distance, Morning Rock stood silhouetted against this vivid backdrop, its distinctive flat top creating a perfect horizontal line that seemed to divide earth from heaven. Thomas found his thoughts returning, as they often had since that dawn expedition, to the pale Mustang and its mysterious presence in the misty fields. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his reverie. Turning toward the trail that connected his modest property to the main road, he saw Hannah riding toward the cabin, her figure easily recognizable even in the fading light. She was not alone. A second rider accompanied her, mounted on a bay horse Thomas didn't recognize. As they drew closer, he identified the stranger as the musician they had observed playing for the pale Mustang. "Evening, Grandpa," Hannah called as they reached the yard, dismounting with easy grace. "Hope you don't mind unexpected company. This is Elijah Cohen, the violinist I mentioned. He's been asking around town about the sleepy Mustang, and I thought you might enjoy comparing notes." Thomas rose from his chair, moving to the porch steps to properly greet his visitors. "No mind at all," he replied, extending a hand to the musician as the man dismounted. "Coffee's still hot, and conversation's always welcome." Elijah Cohen appeared to be in his mid-30s, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors despite his indoor profession. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his smile genuine if somewhat reserved. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Everett," he said, his voice carrying a subtle accent Thomas couldn't quite place. "Your granddaughter speaks highly of your knowledge regarding local legends." "Thomas will do just fine," he replied, gesturing toward the porch. "And legends is a generous term for old stories that may or may not have substance behind them." The three settled onto the porch, Hannah fetching additional cups for coffee after seeing to the horses. As twilight deepened around them, Thomas found himself studying their visitor with quiet interest. There was something about the man that suggested both rootedness and transience, comfortable in the present moment yet not entirely of it, similar in some ways to the quality the pale Mustang had projected. "Hannah tells me you were at Morning Rock the other morning," Thomas began, after preliminary exchanges had established a comfortable rhythm to their conversation. "Seems you had quite an encounter with our local mystery." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful as he gazed toward the now darkening silhouette of the mesa in the distance. I've been traveling through this region for nearly 3 years now, collecting old songs and stories, occasionally composing new ones inspired by what I find. I'd heard whispers about the pale horse at Morning Rock for months before I finally saw it with my own eyes last spring. This information surprised Thomas. You've seen it before then, prior to the other day? Twice, Elijah confirmed. Always at dawn, always alone, always near that same meadow. The first time was purely by chance. I was walking to Copper Creek for an engagement, took a shortcut across those fields, and there it was in the morning mist. I was so startled I simply froze in place, afraid any movement might frighten it away, but it seemed more curious than fearful, watching me for several minutes before simply turning and walking into the trees. He paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. The second time, 6 months later, I brought my violin, thinking that if music soothes ordinary horses, perhaps it might interest this extraordinary one as well. I played just a few minutes before it appeared, almost as if summoned by the melody, though that seems fanciful to say aloud. Not as fanciful as you might think, Thomas replied, finding himself drawn to the musician's straightforward account. There's something about that horse that doesn't quite follow the usual rules, whether it's truly supernatural or simply unusual in its temperament and habits. Hannah returned with fresh coffee, settling onto the porch step near Thomas's chair. What was that piece you were playing? She asked. The one that seemed to call to it so strongly. Elijah's expression softened at the question. I call it Dawn Rider, though that name came after our first musical encounter. It began as improvisation, my attempt to translate into sound what I was seeing and feeling in that moment. The mist, the light, the strange timelessness of the scene. Over subsequent months, it evolved into something more structured, though I still vary it somewhat with each playing. It was beautiful, Hannah said simply. Unlike anything I've heard before. That's very kind, Elijah acknowledged with a slight bow of his head. Music has always been my way of processing experiences that words alone can't quite capture. Some encounters demand their own vocabulary of expression. Thomas nodded understanding, recognizing in the younger man's approach something that resonated with his own relationship to the mysteries he had encountered throughout his life. You mentioned collecting stories, he said. I imagine you've heard other accounts of the Sleepy Mustang beyond your own experiences. Several, Elijah confirmed, though they vary considerably in detail and interpretation. A rancher north of here claims it's the ghost of his grandfather's prize stallion lost in the Great Blizzard of '88. The blacksmith in Copper Creek insists it's one of the original Spanish horses brought by conquistadors, somehow achieving extended longevity through some mystical means he couldn't quite articulate. They remained on their rocky perch a while longer, watching as the day continued to brighten around them. The field where the Mustang had grazed now appeared ordinary once more, beautiful in the way all wild places were beautiful, but no longer seeming to exist half in another world as it had during the pale horse's presence. Thomas found himself filled with a contentment that went deeper than simple satisfaction at having confirmed a local legend. What they had witnessed felt like a gift, one that required no explanation or analysis to be fully appreciated. Time we headed back, I reckon, he finally said, rising with care to avoid overtaxing knees that had grown stiffer during their period of rest. Your father will be wondering if we've ridden clear to Mexico by now. Hannah helped him to his feet, though she was careful to make the assistance appear casual rather than necessary. She understood his pride, his need to maintain independence, even as age gradually imposed its limitations. He knows better than to worry before sundown, she replied with a smile. But I wouldn't mind some breakfast. Watching legendary mustangs and mysterious musicians works up an appetite. They returned to their horses, who had dozed contentedly in the growing warmth of the spring day. As Thomas prepared to mount Atlas, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. Turning toward the distant trees where the pale horse had disappeared, he glimpsed what might have been a flash of light-colored coat among the shadows. There, and gone so quickly he couldn't be certain whether he had actually seen it or merely expected to see it. "Something?" Hannah asked, noticing his distraction. Thomas shook his head slightly. "Just the morning playing tricks," he said, though his tone held no disappointment. Some things were better glimpsed than grasped, better sensed than seen directly. The mystery of the sleepy Mustang seemed appropriately balanced between presence and absence, between the tangible world and whatever lay just beyond it. With Hannah's discreet assistance, he mounted Atlas and turned the gelding's head toward home. As they rode, retracing their path from earlier that morning, Thomas found himself reflecting on the changes he had witnessed throughout his lifetime on this frontier. When he was a boy, the first railway had just reached the territory, bringing with it the rapid acceleration of settlement and development that had transformed vast open spaces into a patchwork of farms, ranches, and growing towns. He had watched forests fall to timber operations, seen rivers dammed and diverted for irrigation, participated in the gradual domestication of what had once been wild country. Yet here, in this quiet corner that progress had largely bypassed, something of the old spirit remained, not just preserved like a specimen in a museum, but alive and breathing, adapting to changed circumstances while maintaining its essential nature. The pale Mustang, whatever its actual origins, embodied that enduring quality. It existed in the present moment, yet carried echoes of a past that was rapidly fading from living memory. That such a creature could still find space to roam, could still emerge from morning mist to graze in peaceful solitude, struck Thomas as a kind of miracle. Small, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but profound in its implications. "Penny for your thoughts," Hannah said as they crested a small rise that offered a final view of Morning Rock behind them, its flat summit now fully illuminated by the mid-morning sun. Thomas smiled, the expression deepening the lines that years of weather and work had etched into his face. "Just thinking that I'm glad to be proven wrong from time to time." "Wrong about what?" she asked, guiding Willow alongside Atlas so they rode stirrup to stirrup. "About what remains possible in this world," he replied. "When you reach my age, it's easy to start believing that all the magic has been explained away, all the mysteries solved or abandoned, that everything extraordinary belongs to the past, and only the ordinary remains for the future." He glanced back once more at the mesa, rising against the clear spring sky. "But what we saw today suggests otherwise. Some things persist despite everything that works against them. Wild horses, strange melodies, moments of perfect communion between seemingly separate worlds." Hannah considered this, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we should tell others? About seeing the sleepy Mustang, I mean?" It was a good question, one that Thomas had been pondering himself during their ride. On one hand, confirmed sightings of the legendary horse were rare enough that their experience would likely be of interest to others in the community, who maintained connections to local folklore. On the other hand, something about the encounter felt private, even sacred, not in a formal religious sense, but in the way that certain experiences seem to exist partly outside the realm of ordinary sharing. "I think," he said carefully, "that stories find their own way of being told when the time is right. For now, I'm content to hold this one close, to let it work whatever changes it might bring, without hurrying the process along." Hannah nodded, seeming to understand what he was trying to express. "Like watching a sunrise," she offered. "You can point it out to someone else, but they still have to see it with their own eyes for it to really matter." Exactly so, Thomas agreed, pleased as always by his granddaughter's insight. Though I wouldn't object to visiting that meadow again sometime, perhaps seeing if our pale friend makes regular appearances. The suggestion brought a smile to Hannah's face. I was hoping you'd say that. Some quests are worth continuing, even when their original goal has been achieved. They rode in companionable silence for a time, each absorbed in private reflections on the morning's events. The sun continued its climb toward noon, warming the air and bringing out the distinctive sense of spring. Fresh growth, damp earth, the subtle perfume of early wildflowers hidden among the grasses. Birds darted overhead, busy with the serious work of nest building and territorial proclamations. The world proceeded with its ancient rhythms, neither hurried nor delayed by human observations or interpretations. As they approached Thomas's cabin, visible now across the final stretch of open ground, he found himself already anticipating their next journey to Morning Rock, not with the urgency that had driven this first expedition, but with a patient expectation that felt appropriate to this new chapter of his life. At 73, he had finally learned that some pursuits benefited from a gentler approach, not grasping or demanding, but attending and appreciating. "Will you stay for breakfast?" he asked as they reached the small corral adjacent to his stable. "I may not have your mother's talent for cooking, but I can still manage decent flapjacks if you're not too particular." Hannah dismounted with the fluid grace of youth, then moved to help with Atlas's saddle before Thomas could strain himself with the awkward weight. "I'd like that," she said, "and maybe after you could tell me some of those stories you mentioned, about the other unexplained things you've seen over the years. Seems like a good day for such tales." Thomas nodded, pleased by the suggestion. He had accumulated many such accounts throughout his long life on the frontier, experiences that defied simple explanation, yet stopped short of the supernatural in the way that term was commonly understood. Lights glimpsed on distant hills where no human presence should have been possible. Animals behaving in ways that suggested more complex awareness than conventional wisdom allowed them. Moments when time seemed to fold upon itself, creating brief windows through which other possibilities might be glimpsed. He had rarely shared these stories, even with family, partly from the natural reticence that was his generational inheritance, and partly from concern that they might be dismissed or misinterpreted. But Hannah had proven herself a worthy recipient of such confidences, neither too credulous nor too skeptical, capable of holding mystery without demanding its resolution in predetermined terms. "It's a fair trade," he agreed as they led their horses toward the stable. "Stories for companionship and a helping hand with breakfast dishes after." Hannah's laugh brightened the late morning air. "Always the practical rancher, making sure every exchange balances out." "Old habits," Thomas acknowledged with a smile of his own. Yet as they settled the horses and walked together toward the cabin, he found himself thinking that some trades could never be truly balanced. That what he had received this day, both in the confirmation of the sleepy Mustang's existence and in the shared experience with his granddaughter, far outweighed anything he might offer in return. The pale horse would remain in its own realm, moving between visibility and mystery according to its nature and purposes. The musician would continue creating melodies that bridged worlds through the universal language of beauty, and Thomas would go on with his quiet life, enriched by the knowledge that wonder had not been entirely mapped and measured out of existence, that it persisted in hidden pockets across the landscape, waiting to be encountered by those willing to rise before dawn and journey toward the places where first light touched the waiting earth. As he opened the cabin door, welcoming Hannah into the simple home that had sheltered his later years, Thomas felt a deep contentment settle within him. Not the restless satisfaction of a goal achieved, but the quieter peace that came from finding himself exactly where and how he was meant to be. Whether he ever saw the sleepy Mustang again or not, this day had altered something essential in his understanding of the world and his place within it. Some quests, as Hannah had observed, continued beyond the achievement of their original purpose, becoming not destinations but paths, ways of moving through life with attentive reverence for its persistent mysteries. The rest of the day stretched before them, ordinary in its particulars, yet transformed by the extraordinary experience that had preceded it. Thomas moved toward his small kitchen, ready to begin the familiar ritual of breakfast preparation, carrying within him the image of a pale horse grazing peacefully in morning mist, a living emblem of all that remained wild and wonderful in a world that too often prioritized progress over preservation. Explanation: outside the window, Morning Rock stood silhouetted against the clear spring sky, its ancient presence a reminder that some things endured beyond human lifespans or understanding. The mesa would catch tomorrow's first light, as it had for countless dawns before, perhaps illuminating again the mysterious Mustang in its solitary communion with the awakening day. And Thomas, whether present to witness that moment or not, would carry its possibility within him like a talisman against forgetting that wonder remained an essential element of a fully lived life, as necessary as shelter, as sustaining as food, as comforting as the company of those who shared one's appreciation for the ineffable mysteries that persisted despite all efforts to explain them away. In the simple act of mixing batter for flapjacks, while Hannah set the table behind him, Thomas found himself humming a fragment of melody, the tune the traveling musician had played for the pale horse in that misty meadow. The notes came to him with surprising clarity, as if the music had etched itself into his memory with unusual precision. Perhaps it was the context in which he'd heard it. Moments of wonder often burned themselves more deeply into recollection than everyday experiences. Or perhaps there was something in the melody itself that made it particularly memorable, a quality that spoke directly to something fundamental in human consciousness. "That's it, isn't it?" Hannah asked, pausing in her arrangement of plates and silverware. "The musician's song." Thomas nodded, somewhat surprised by his ability to recall the complex melody. "Strange how clearly it stayed with me. I'm not usually one for remembering tunes after a single hearing." "It was beautiful," Hannah said, resuming her task, "like it was made specifically for that moment, that place, that horse. I've been hearing fragments of it in my mind too, though not as completely as you're humming it." "Music has its own kind of magic," Thomas observed, pouring the first circle of batter onto his heated griddle. "Creates bridges between experiences, between people, apparently between species as well, judging by how that Mustang responded." This observation led him to further reflection. As he attended to the cooking, throughout his life he had witnessed many instances of communication that transcended conventional boundaries. Horses that understood commands never explicitly taught, cattle that sensed approaching weather changes before any human detection, wild creatures that sometimes showed awareness of human intentions that went beyond ordinary animal intuition. Such experiences had never fit neatly within the increasingly mechanistic view of nature that dominated the modern world, yet they persisted in the direct observations of those who worked closely with animals and wild places. The pale Mustang represented perhaps the most extraordinary example of such transcendence he had encountered. A creature that moved with evident awareness between the acknowledged physical world and something less easily defined. Not supernatural exactly, at least not in the sense of violating natural laws, but perhaps revealing that those laws encompassed more than commonly recognized, that nature itself contained dimensions not readily accessible through ordinary observation or conventional thinking. The flapjack bubbled, ready to be turned, and Thomas attended to this simple task with the same care he had brought to watching the pale horse earlier that morning. In both activities, he found a similar satisfaction, the recognition that being fully present to what each moment offered, whether mundane or miraculous, represented the truest form of participation in life's enduring mysteries. That evening, as sunset painted the western sky in layers of gold and crimson, Thomas found himself once more on his small porch, rocking gently in the chair that had supported his contemplations through many such twilights. The day had passed pleasantly in Hannah's company, their conversations weaving between memories of shared experiences and reflections on the morning's extraordinary encounter. She had departed after their midday meal, promising to return soon for another expedition to Morning Rock, perhaps at a different hour, to observe how changing light might transform both landscape and possibility. Now, in the gathering dusk, Thomas allowed his thoughts to wander freely across the territory of his long life. From earliest childhood on a homestead 20 miles east of his current location, through decades of building his ranch and raising his family, to these quieter years of retirement and reflection, he had witnessed profound changes in both the physical landscape and the human relationship to it. What had once been wild country, inhabited primarily by native peoples, had transformed into settled territory, crisscrossed by roads, fences, and increasingly by power lines and other modern intrusion. Yet despite these changes, or perhaps in subtle resistance to them, pockets of the original spirit remained, persisting in places overlooked by progress or deliberately preserved by those who recognized their value. Morning Rock and its surrounding fields represented one such pocket, maintaining connection to older rhythms and deeper mysteries that industrial development had obscured elsewhere. The pale Mustang, whatever its actual nature, embodied this persistence, a living reminder that not everything of value could be measured, catalogued, or controlled. Its appearance at dawn, when light itself existed in transition between absence and presence, seemed symbolically appropriate. Like the horse, that particular quality of illumination, neither night nor full day, but the liminal space between, could be experienced, but never quite captured or contained. As darkness settled more fully around his cabin, Thomas found himself recalling other encounters from throughout his life that had carried similar qualities of mystery and wonder. The sudden appearance of a mountain lion on a ridge above his cattle herd during a summer drought, its golden eyes meeting his for a moment of inexplicable communication, before it turned and vanished among the rocks. The perfect circular rainbow he had once witnessed surrounding his shadow on morning mist, moving as he moved, yet remaining complete in its geometric perfection. The night he had watched swirling lights dance above a distant peak during a winter storm, too coherent for lightning, yet too sustained for any human source, in such remote and dangerous conditions. Each experience had affected him deeply at the time, yet he had rarely spoken of them afterward, partly from the natural reticence common to his generation and upbringing, partly from awareness that such accounts often met with either excessive credulity or dismissive skepticism, neither response doing justice to the actual nature of what had been witnessed. Some experiences existed most truthfully in direct personal memory, resistant to translation into second-hand narrative, without loss of essential qualities. Yet now, in his later years, Thomas found himself reconsidering this habitual privacy. The morning's shared observation of the pale Mustang with Hannah had demonstrated that some mysteries could be witnessed communally without diminishment. that certain experiences might even be enriched through mutual recognition and appreciation. Perhaps some of his accumulated encounters deserved preservation through careful telling, not as conclusive explanations, but as invitations to remain open to wonder in all its manifestations. This possibility seemed particularly relevant in a world increasingly dominated by mechanical explanations and material concerns. The pale Mustang offered living counterpoint to such reductionist thinking, not by disproving scientific understanding, but by suggesting its incompleteness. When applied to the full range of existence, some phenomena might be entirely natural yet still transcend conventional explanations, revealing dimensions of reality that current frameworks could acknowledge but not fully account for. As the first stars emerged in the darkening sky overhead, Thomas rose from his chair with the careful movements that had become necessary in recent years. His body reminded him regularly of its accumulated wear, joints that protested sudden movements, muscles that tired more quickly than in youth, the occasional unexplained ache that arrived without apparent cause and departed just as mysteriously. Yet he had made peace with these limitations, recognizing them as natural consequences of a life lived actively in direct engagement with the physical world. Inside his cabin, he lit the lamp that stood on his small writing desk near the window. Though he had never considered himself particularly literary, Thomas had maintained a journal throughout most of his adult life. Brief entries recording weather conditions, cattle operations, family events, and occasionally personal reflections on experiences that seemed worthy of preservation. The leather-bound volume currently in use was perhaps half filled with his careful handwriting, each entry dated and typically concluding with brief notes about atmospheric conditions, as befitted someone whose livelihood had depended so directly on natural forces. Opening to the next blank page, Thomas dated his entry and then paused, pen hovering above paper as he considered how to record the morning's experience. After a moment's reflection, he began writing in his characteristic straightforward style, neither embellishing nor diminishing what he and Hannah had witnessed. He described the pale Mustang's appearance in the misty field, its interaction with the traveling musician, the strange quality of recognition that had passed between horse and human during the musical exchange. As he wrote, Thomas found unexpected satisfaction in transforming direct experience into written account, not as replacement for memory, but as complement to it. The process of selecting precise words for each aspect of the encounter required careful attention to details that might otherwise have blurred with time, preserving nuances that contributed to the event's extraordinary quality. Though no written description could fully capture the feeling of being present in that dawn moment, the attempt itself represented valuable engagement with its significance. Completing his account, Thomas added the customary weather notation, then a brief addendum, witnessed with Hannah, first shared observation of phenomena previously experienced only in solitude, difference significant, confirmation without diminishment, appreciation multiplied through mutual recognition. This final reflection seemed particularly important, the recognition that some mysteries benefited from shared witness, their significance amplified rather than reduced through communal experience. Throughout his life, Thomas had valued self-reliance and independence, sometimes to the point of excessive solitude. Yet Hannah's presence that morning had undeniably enriched his encounter with the pale Mustang, offering perspectives he might have missed alone, while confirming the objective reality of what they observed. Closing his journal, Thomas extinguished the lamp and moved toward his bedroom at the cabin's rear. Outside, night had fully claimed the landscape, transforming daytime familiarity into the deeper mystery that darkness always brought to even well-known terrain. Through his window, stars gleamed with the particular brilliance characteristic of clear nights in this region, their ancient light crossing unimaginable distances to reach his aging eyes. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the West be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.